Last week we talked about beginning to pray and trusting that the desire to pray and the desire to be with God in fact comes from God, and that that's a call from God. We also talked about the examination of conscience, which is a 4 or 5 step review of the day. This week I'd like to talk about another kind of prayer, sometimes that goes by the name of Ignatian Contemplation, Ignatian prayer, imaginative prayer. There's lots of different ways of talking about it. Let's call it Ignatian Contemplation. Basically, that kind of prayer is using your imagination to place you in a scripture scene. Now, some Jesuits will say that it was invented by Ignatius, but I would say it's probably more accurate to say it was popularized by Ignatius. In Ignatian Contemplation, you use each of your senses and imagine yourself in a scripture passage. So let's take, for example, the story of Jesus on the sea with the disciples during the storm at sea. If you imagine yourself using your sight, you would say to yourself, what do I see? You would close your eyes and start to pray and start to ask God to help you to see the scene. So you would see the boat, obviously, the disciples around you. You would see Jesus asleep in the boat. Next, you'd move on to imagining what you would be hearing. So you'd hear the waves, the wind, maybe even the disciples snoring. What do you feel on your skin? Perhaps if you imagine yourself as one of the disciples, you see yourself wearing sort of like a rough cloak or something like that. You might feel the roughness of the wood, the wetness of the sea spray. What do you smell? If you're in a fishing boat, maybe you'll smell fish. Maybe you'll smell a little body odor from the other disciples. You might probably smell the salt spray. So you use each of your senses, sight, hearing, smell, touch, and you try to place yourself in the scene as much as you can. So it's very much like placing yourself almost in a movie, as if you're there. Then what happens is you remember the scene, you remember the gospel scene. Usually you could have the book in front of you, the gospel book in front of you, and really try to enter into the scene. Now, a lot of times people report that not much happens, and that's typical in prayer. Prayer isn't always wonderful and fruitful. Sometimes it's very dry. But frequently you can imagine yourself present in the scene with the disciples and with Jesus. So in this case, you might imagine yourself on the boat and with the disciples and wondering, if you remember the story, why Jesus is asleep. You might start to feel with the disciples kind of angry and discouraged that Jesus is seemingly asleep. When Jesus wakes up and stills the storm, you might find yourself amazed and maybe even fearful. You know, in any of these prayer experiences in Ignatian Contemplation, any opportunity you get to spend more time in Scripture and with these stories on a closer level, to remind ourselves that these things really happen, can always enhance your appreciation of Scripture. So I think it's always good to do them. But sometimes you'll be surprised at some of the emotions that come up. For example, I was praying this story once and I found myself very angry that Jesus wasn't awake, that Jesus wasn't more attentive to the needs of the disciples. And I started to say to myself, gee, there are places in my own life where I don't feel like Jesus is really paying attention, where I feel like kind of he's asleep. So that led me to think about places where I might also be overlooking his miraculous power. So while Jesus might not seem to be active in the way that I hope, that there are other ways that Jesus is very much alive. And I started to think about trust and how much do I really trust him, like the disciples needed to trust him when he was in the boat. So you might be surprised at what happens in Ignatian Contemplation. In short, it's a way of using your imagination to place yourself in Scripture. Sometimes it might be dry, but sometimes it's very fruitful, and you can really get a sense of being with the disciples. Now, one final problem some people have. When I started out doing this kind of prayer, I asked my spiritual director, whether or not this was really sensible. Wasn't I sort of making this up in my head? Wasn't this all sort of kind of a mind game? And he said something to me that really helped me in terms of liberating me from those doubts, which was basically that if God can work through relationships and the sacrament and Scripture, then God can certainly use the gift of our imaginations to draw closer to us in prayer.